So I'm going to be doing another solid color, and this time I'm just going to use one dye to do this color. But again, I'm going to apply it in 2 coats. So I'm initially going to put 600 mils of dye in the pan, and I'm going to and of course there's no acid in here yet at this point. Another thing I've done is I've rinsed my gloves off because I want to make sure that there's no dye on my hands from the previous color, because when I put my hands in here, that could potentially wreck that color. I don't know if you can see already a little bit of pink dye, I didn't quite get it all off, has dripped onto these fibers. Now the color I'm putting on here will cover it, so it's okay, but you can imagine if this was going to be a light color, like say a yellow, and then I dripped a bit of pink or red dye on here, this color would be garbage. So I don't have to worry about that, but that's another little tip. Keep that in mind to make sure that your hands or your gloves are clean before you, from the previous color, before you start working on your next color. So again, I don't pour the dye directly onto the yarn. Always pour it into the water when you're dyeing solid colors. Make sure that there's no lumps or granules of undissolved dye powder, because that will give you a patchy look. Here's another tip. If you do see that, like it's not happening here, but sometimes it does happen. So what I do is I look for that. If I do see it, I just use like a whisk to break up any bits of undissolved dye powder, and you'll see it easily in the pan. So just do that to just make sure everything is dissolved. So there's another tip. I just wanted to show an example of what happens when you're dyeing a solid color and the dye isn't properly dissolved in the water. But you see these little spots here? Let me open it up. So take a look at that. Look at these ugly orange bits that are in the skein. So this should be a solid yellow. Okay, take a look at that. See that? So what happens is that sometimes the dye, when it sits, some dyes are prone to this. They get kind of gelatinous and they coagulate. And so even when I shake it up and put it into the water, there still will be these bits of dye that kind of become gelatinous and they don't dissolve. So if I dye the yarn with those bits in it, you see where you'll get these areas where the dye will put spots on the yarn. So I can't sell the yarn like that. So I'm going to use this yarn in a project, but basically that ruined the color. So I demonstrated whisking the dye that is prone to doing that. So I learned this through trial and error. So hopefully, me showing you this will help you to avoid that as well. So that's where you need to learn how your dye does react. And you know, again, you're gonna have to experiment and see what happens. So I know the colors that do that, so I always make sure to take my whisk as I demonstrated, and I will make sure that when I pour it into the pan that all of the dye is whisked again to make sure that there's no gelatinous or globby bits that will end up doing this to my yarn. And so far doing that, I've been able to avoid this happening when I'm dyeing solid colors. So again, because there's no acid in here, this dye is just staining the yarn at this point. It's not permanently adhered to it, but right now we're just trying to introduce the fiber to the dye and make sure that there isn't any undyed or patchy areas. We want to stain this evenly so that when the acid is added and the dye just does start to adhere, that it will look nice and even. So I'm going to add the same amount to the second pan. I don't always wear gloves because I don't like the feeling of gloves on my hand. It makes it hard to feel the yarn and I just find it awkward. But because I'm totally for this technique, immersing my hands in the dye, it is a good idea to wear gloves because just like the fiber, our skin is protein. So you can imagine that when I add the acid to this, whatever is dyeing the fiber is also going to dye my hands. And that's going to take a while to wear off. So trust me, I don't always wear gloves, so my hands are often coated with dye, and then it might take a week for it to eventually wear off. And dye on the fingernails is not a pretty look either. It just makes your fingers look dirty all the time. But that's one of the That's something you have to deal with when you dye yarn regularly, but you can help avoid that by wearing gloves. So already that stain is looking really good. I can see it looks fairly even so far. So I know that when I add the acid, that'll have the dye is going to give me a nice even look or coating. I always flip the yarn, so you want to make sure that both sides are evenly coated. So it's time to add the acid, and I'm going to add again about a cup of acid. I don't want to add too much acid because I want the acid to work slowly on this yarn. I don't want the dye to strike quickly. I want it to take its time to absorb so that I get a really nice, even, solid coating. So again, I'm going to just gently move the yarn around to make sure that the dye and acid moves freely around each strand of yarn. And I can tell, because the water is starting to look lighter, you can see that dye is being absorbed into the yarn. So before it's totally absorbed, I want to make sure to flip the yarn to get the other side. I want to make sure that there's enough dye in the pan to get the other side as well. And as you practice, you'll get a rhythm going and you'll be able to move fairly quickly. This is taking me longer than usual simply because I'm explaining as I go along, but this process is quite fast and simple. I work quickly to get the yarn coated on each side, and dyeing solid colors goes quite quickly for me. All right, so this looks good, but it still isn't rich enough for me. My whole brand or aesthetic for dyeing that I like, that I prefer, is really rich, deep, saturated colors. So my colors are usually, I guess, what you would call oversaturated. That was a bit hard to say. So I add a lot of dye to the yarn because I really like a rich look. So I'm literally over dyeing the yarn, or putting more dye probably than it needs, because I want to make sure that I get that really rich look for most of my colors. I do have some light ones that I don't do that with, but for the most part I really like really deep, rich colors. After all, my business is called Essence of Autumn Yarn. And when you think of the autumn season, the colors that you associate with that are really rich jewel tones and saturated. So most of my colorways are like that. So I'm now adding the second coat of color. Again, it's 600 mils, and I'm using the exact same color this time that I applied before. And again, I'm gently manipulating the fibers to make sure that every strand of yarn is coated. So you can see the difference between the two pans. You can see how much darker and richer this is so far. So you can see that difference. So if you like, so say if your color preference is, or if you wanted a lighter color, probably one coating of the dye would suffice. But I'm going, and this is basically kind of the true color. So because I'm over dyeing it, I'm going to, or I'm kind of doubling the color, I'm going to get a much darker shade of that same color. Just keep in mind too, one of the reasons why I do that is because once the yarn always looks darker in the water. once this is spun out and it dries, the color's going to look lighter. So I like to over dye to make sure that it stays the rich color that I want. So this, once it's dry, will look even lighter. I want it to look more like this. So that's one thing to keep in mind as well. Once the yarn is dried, it will look a bit lighter. And again, these are things you're going to learn through trial and error. But I am hoping through my videos, I can't cover every single thing. I don't remember every single point, but I'm hoping that at least it will give you some pointers and give you a good start, a good foundation, so that, you know, the learning process might be a little less daunting. So again, I always like to flip the yarn before all that dye is, so there still is quite a bit of dye in there. Before it's totally absorbed on one side, I like to make sure that I flip it so that both sides are evenly coated with dye. So that's it. Again, that's all the work that I need to do for this. I'm not seeing any patchiness or areas that don't. For the most part, it does look fairly evenly coated. Once this dries, because it is hand dyed, there might be some slight imperfections, but they're going to be very minimal, and they're really just going to add to the beauty of the yarn. It's not going to be anything majorly noticeable, but when you knit it, it's going to add just some beautiful depth of shade and movement to your project. It's going to just add some visual interest, and it's going to look really good. So what we're trying to avoid is anything that majorly looks out of place. We want the initial, when you look at it, you want your eye to read it as a solid color. But slight imperfections, there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, so you see all of this mess here around the edge of the pan. I don't want that to potentially drip off and contaminate any colors that are underneath these pans once I put it in the oven. So again, just take a damp rag and wipe the edge off. There's nothing wrong with being neat and tidy. This looks a lot nicer anyway. So I suggest that you do it, because when you move these pans, if there is dye on the edge, even if there isn't any chance that that things might drip off to another pan, well, that dye can still transfer to your hands, and then you could potentially contaminate a pan that way. So it's a good practice to always work as cleanly as possible. I just wanted to quickly demonstrate dyeing a solid color, but using a lot less dye to get a lighter color. So the color I'm dyeing now is Dusty Rose. So I want it to be a really muted dusty rose, faded rose color. So in the other colors I've shown you, I really used a lot of dye. I used 600 mils of dye for 5 skeins of yarn. And then I put a second coat of the same amount on to really get an oversaturated color. But because I want this to be so muted and faded, I'm only going to use about a quarter of the amount. So instead of 600 mils of dye, I'm going to use 300, and I'm not going to do a second coat. But all the other steps are going to be the same. So the color I'm using is actually very dark, but because I'm not using a lot of it, it's really going to disperse in the water, and it's going to produce a much lighter color than usual. So again, there's no acid in the water. I'm going to add that later. So already you can see that kind of dirty pink color coming through. And this isn't a pink dye, but because I'm using a small amount of it, I'm able to manipulate the color and get a much lighter shade. Now also, because I'm not going to be putting a second coat of color on this, there's more opportunity for there to be some irregularities in the color. But for this color, it's okay, I don't mind that, because I do want it to look kind of faded and antiqued and kind of like a vintage rose color. So those slight irregularities in the color will really add to the character and of the color and give me the faded, muted effect that I want. And remember too that when this dries, it looks darker in the water. So it's going to be lighter once it dries. So you really can play, even with just using one color, play with the amounts of dye that you use. And you can really get a lot of variation in just one color of dye. So give that a try, experiment, and see what you can do. So you can see how that's looking. I haven't added any acid yet, but I'm just going to flip these. And this is the muted effect that I'm going for. A really pretty old-fashioned dusty pink. So if you look here, you can see where there is lighter areas. Now I haven't added the acid, but so once the acid's in here, it'll probably pick up some more dye. But I can already tell that there's going to be areas even with the acid, that are going to be slightly lighter than other areas, but that's okay for this color. It's only going to add to the beauty of it. So keep that in mind. Think about the effect that you want. And sometimes embrace those little imperfections, because you might find that you love how it turns out. Okay, so that's good. I'm going to add the acid. And I'm not even going to flip these again, because there's so little dye in there that the acid, once I add that acid, it's just going to suck it up. I don't think I'm even going to have time to flip it before it absorbs that. And I'm using the same amount of acid, just 1 cup for this amount of yarn. So that's looking that's the look I'm going for. And you can see there's some lighter areas and some slightly darker areas. And once that dries and is knit up, those little light dark areas, they're going to be very subtle, but they're going to add so much life to the knitted project. It's going to look really pretty. See, that looks really beautiful. And again, this is going to be slightly lighter once it dries. All right, so that's that color done. And see, there's hardly any color left in that water. So you can see how fast the dye absorbed, because there really wasn't that much added to the water. And it will continue to be absorbed, and eventually, very shortly, that water will be clear. So you can see here that the dye has all exhausted from the water. There's a slight tinge in here of color, but really most of the dye is in the fibers. So I let that cook for a few hours in the oven, and now it's all set and ready to be washed. I also let the yarn cool to room temperature. So it's not hot. It's had a few hours to totally cool down. You can see now how nice and vibrant that color is. Now for some reason it's reading kind of orange in the camera, but I assure you this is a really beautiful deep cherry red. You know, when you look at that, that looks pretty good. That looks pretty solid, doesn't it? And that's what we were going for. So I'm going to show you the other color that I demonstrated. This really nice deep berry color. Look at that. Doesn't that look beautiful? Look how nice that looks. And you can see that most of this water is pretty much clear. You can see a slight tinge in the water, but if I was to stick bare yarn in here, it wouldn't, there's not enough dye in there to even register that there's any color. So that means that all of the dye exhausted, and it's now in the fibers of the yarn. And cooking it, letting it heat through for a few hours, make sure that that dye is set properly into the yarn, and when it's knit and washed later on, it should have little to no bleeding. Now some colors, some dyes do take a little bit of extra time to exhaust. They have so much pigment in them that sometimes not every single bit of the dye will absorb into the fiber, because, you know, the fiber can only absorb so much. And already, as I explained earlier, I'm oversaturating the color because I really love that look. So I'm adding probably more dye than the yarn can absorb. So this little bit of color, like you can see, it's hardly anything. Let me just put it here so you can see, like that really, that is just a little tiny tinge. That's nothing to worry about. I'm not worried about that at all. So I know that this color has fully absorbed and has fully set. So when you're dyeing your yarn, you know, like colors like reds and certain blues, they have, if they're really deep colors, they have a lot of pigment in them. So you can expect that that will happen, that sometime a little tinge of color will be left, but that's nothing to worry about. But most colors will totally come out, the water will totally come out clear when you're done. So you'll be able to see that in this color. See how clear that is? So there's absolutely no dye left in here. And remember, I didn't use that much dye to start with because I wanted this to be a really faded looking color. So that's probably part of the reason why this was able to exhaust fully. See how clear that is? And so I did say that this color, because I used so little dye, I was expecting to see areas that were maybe a little bit lighter or a little bit darker, and you can see that. But I don't mind that for this color because it's the look I'm going for. I want it to be a faded rosy color. So that is perfect. When it dries, it's going to look even better. It's going to look even more faded and beautiful. I dyed quite a few more colors that I didn't show. So I'm going to get them all taken out of the oven right now. I'm going to wash them, I'm going to let them dry, and then you're going to see the end result, how all the colors turned out. But really that's it in a nutshell. I've shown you how I dye solid colors. I hope that you give it a try and that you really enjoyed this video, and I look forward to showing you the end results when the yarn is all washed and dried and looking its best. So thanks for watching and stay tuned.